In 1861, the most powerful woman in America stood before her mirror in the White House, preparing for her first official reception as First Lady. The hands adjusting her gown, fastening each delicate button, smoothing every fold of silk, belonged to a woman who, just 6 years earlier, had been someone's property. Elizabeth Keckley had transformed herself from an enslaved seamstress who supported 17 people with her needle into the personal confidante of Mary Todd Lincoln. She'd purchased her own freedom and her son's for $1,200, moved to Washington as an entrepreneur, and ascended to the most intimate position of trust in the nation's most scrutinized household. But here's what makes her story unlike any other transformation you've heard. This same woman who dressed the First Lady, who founded one of the Civil War's most important relief organizations, who built herself from nothing into everything, would die forgotten and penniless in a charity home she'd helped establish. She'd lose her only son to the war, her closest friend to betrayal, her business to scandal, and her legacy to silence. So here's the question that haunts her story. What does it mean to achieve everything you fought for, to rise higher than anyone thought possible, only to watch it all crumble because you dared to tell the truth? Stay until the end, because the answer reveals something profound about the price of speaking when the world demands your silence. Elizabeth Hobbs entered this world in February 1818 in Dinwiddie County, Virginia, on Colonel Armistead Burwell's farm. She entered it as property. Her mother, Agnes Hobbs, called Aggie by those who claimed to own her, had been sexually assaulted by Burwell. That's how Elizabeth came to be. That's the reality we need to name clearly. Her biological father was the man who enslaved her mother, but the man Elizabeth called father, the man who loved her as his own, was George Pleasant Hobbs. He was a literate enslaved man who worked on a neighboring plantation. He was devoted to Elizabeth, regarded her as her daughter in every way that mattered. He'd visit when he could, bringing whatever small comfort was possible in a system designed to destroy families. He'd read to her when he came, sharing the gift of literacy in stolen moments. Those visits were everything to young Elizabeth. They were proof that love could exist even in bondage, that family could form even when the law denied its existence. In 1831, when Elizabeth was 13, George Pleasant Hobbs was forced to move to Tennessee with his enslaver. Just like that, the man who'd been her father was gone, ripped away because someone else owned his body, owned his time, owned his future. Elizabeth and her mother stayed behind in Virginia, still enslaved, still trapped. This separation, this casual destruction of family bonds, was just the beginning of what Elizabeth would endure. She'd later recall the day he left, how he'd held her and promised to find a way back, how she'd watched him walk away knowing the promise was impossible. The system that enslaved them didn't care about promises, didn't care about love, didn't care about the bond between a father and daughter. It only cared about profit and control. She labored for 3 different branches of the Burwell family over the next decades. 37 years total she'd spend in bondage to these people. At 14, she was transferred to Robert Burwell's household in Hillsborough, North Carolina, and that's when conditions got worse. Robert Burwell's wife took an immediate dislike to Elizabeth. The reasons didn't matter, couldn't be rationalized, made no sense. Sometimes enslavers just decided to hate someone, and there was nothing that person could do about it. The beatings became frequent, vicious, targeted. Elizabeth was beaten for reasons that made no sense, beaten because she existed, beaten because she couldn't fight back. The violence was meant to break her spirit, to teach her that she had no value beyond her labor, to remind her constantly that she was property. But here's what you need to understand about Elizabeth, even at this young age. Despite the beatings, despite the constant threat of violence, something in her refused to break. Historical accounts tell us she eventually spoke up about the beatings. She told someone they needed to stop. Think about that. An enslaved teenage girl with no legal rights, no protection, no power, found a way to make her voice heard. We don't know exactly who she spoke to or what she said, but we know the beating stopped, not because the system changed, but because Elizabeth demanded it. That's not just survival, that's resistance. That's a young woman claiming whatever tiny piece of agency she could grasp. Then came the violence that had no name in law, no protection, no remedy. When Elizabeth was 18 years old, a white man named Alexander Mackenzie Kirkland, a neighbor of the Burwells and a local store owner, began raping her. This wasn't a single assault. It continued for 4 years. 4 years of systematic sexual violence that Elizabeth had no legal recourse to stop. State laws at the time prohibited enslaved men from raping white women, but they provided zero protection for enslaved women. The law saw her as property, not a person. Her body wasn't hers to defend. Kirkland could do what he wanted, when he wanted, and the legal system offered her nothing. No justice, no protection, no acknowledgement that a crime was even occurring. In 1839, Elizabeth gave birth to a son. She named him George, after the father who'd loved her, not the man who'd violated her. Even in this, even in naming her child, she claimed what agency she could. Her son was biracial, born from violence, but she'd raise him with love. She'd give him the name that meant something to her heart. She'd pour into him all the protection and care she'd been denied. George became her reason to keep going, her hope for a future beyond bondage, her proof that something good could come from something terrible. The years passed slowly. Elizabeth kept sewing. Her skills with a needle became extraordinary, refined through endless practice and natural talent. She'd been taught basic sewing as a child, but she developed it into something far beyond basic. She could look at a garment and understand its construction, could envision designs and execute them flawlessly, could work with the finest fabrics and most complex patterns. Her reputation grew, even within the constraints of slavery. People knew that Elizabeth's work was exceptional. The Garland family, another branch of the Burwell clan she'd been transferred to, recognized her value. She supported 17 members of the Garland family with her work, 17 people living off the labor of one enslaved woman. Her economic value to them was obvious. She was making them wealthy while owning nothing herself. By the early 1850s, Elizabeth was in her 30s, still enslaved, still supporting the Garland family in St. Louis, Missouri. They'd moved west, and she'd been brought along as valuable property. Her son George was growing up, and Elizabeth began to see a possibility she'd never dared imagine before. Freedom, not freedom granted, but freedom purchased. The idea started small, just a whisper in her mind. What if she could buy herself? What if she could buy George? What if they could actually own themselves? She approached Anne Burwell Garland, her enslaver, with a proposal. "Let me buy myself and my son. Let us purchase our own bodies." Anne Garland said no. Of course she said no. Why would she give up someone generating so much income? But Elizabeth kept asking. For 2 years, she begged for permission. 2 years of persistent, patient negotiation while still working, still sewing, still making the Garlands money. She'd bring it up carefully, respectfully, always aware that pushing too hard could result in punishment or sale to someone worse. She had to balance determination with deference, hope with pragmatism. Finally, in 1855, Anne Garland agreed. The price was $1,200 for both Elizabeth and George. In today's money, that's roughly $40,000 to $50,000. That was the price tag on their humanity. Elizabeth was 37 years old, had been enslaved for her entire life, and now she had permission to purchase herself. But permission wasn't freedom. She still had to raise the money. Now Elizabeth faced a different challenge. How does an enslaved woman raise $1,200? She did it the same way she'd done everything else. With her needle, with her skill, with her determination. She took on extra work, sewing for clients in St. Louis beyond what she owed the Garlands. Her reputation as a dressmaker was growing. White women of society wanted her work. They recognized her talent even if they didn't recognize her humanity. They'd commission dresses, pay her for her labor, and she'd save every penny she could. The work was exhausting. She'd fulfill her obligations to the Garlands during the day, then sew late into the night for paying clients. She'd take on any commission, any project, anything that would bring her closer to that $1,200 goal. Her fingers ached constantly. Her eyes strained in poor light. Her back hurt from hunching over her sewing, but she kept going because freedom was worth any amount of pain. Her clients, seeing her determination, began to help. These were white patrons who'd come to respect her skill enough to invest in her freedom. They loaned her money to help reach the full amount. This wasn't charity born of moral conviction about slavery being wrong. Most of these women still supported the institution, but they developed personal relationships with Elizabeth, valued her work, and were willing to help her specifically. It was complicated, morally messy, but it was what Elizabeth had to work with. For 3 years, Elizabeth sewed and saved and borrowed. 3 years of relentless work, of hope deferred, of watching the total slowly climb toward that impossible number. She kept meticulous records, knew exactly how much she had, how much she still needed, how many more dresses she'd have to make. George watched his mother work herself to exhaustion for their freedom. He was a teenager now, old enough to understand what she was sacrificing, old enough to feel the weight of her determination. On November 15, 1855, Elizabeth Keckley, 37 years old, purchased herself and her son. She held the papers that said she was no longer property. She was free. The moment must have been overwhelming. After 37 years of bondage, after rape and beatings and separation and endless labor, she owned herself. Her body was hers, her time was hers, her future was hers to determine. But freedom came with debt. She'd borrowed money to make up the full $1,200, and she spent the next several years working in St. Louis to repay every cent. She wouldn't start her free life owing anyone. She'd earn it completely. This was crucial to Elizabeth. She wanted her freedom to be absolute, unencumbered, fully hers. So she kept sewing, kept building her business, kept saving until every loan was repaid. During these years in St. Louis as a free woman, Elizabeth's business grew substantially. She wasn't just taking whatever work came her way anymore. She could be selective, could charge what her skills were worth, could build a client base of wealthy women who valued quality. She developed a reputation for discretion as well as skill. The women she sewed for trusted her with their secrets, their insecurities about their bodies, their anxieties about social events. Elizabeth learned to be not just a dressmaker, but a confidant. She'd listen while she worked, offer reassurance, keep confidences absolutely. This combination of exceptional skill and trustworthiness made her invaluable. She dressed some of the most prominent women in St. Louis society. They'd come to her home for fittings, discuss their needs, trust her judgment about fabrics and styles. Elizabeth had an eye for what would flatter different body types, what colors would work with different complexions, what styles would suit different personalities. She could look at a woman and envision the perfect dress for her. This wasn't just technical skill, this was artistry. Her son George was growing into a young man during these years. Elizabeth had raised him to be proud, educated, ambitious. She'd taught him to read and write, skills she'd learned from her father, figured George Pleasant Hobbs. She'd instilled in him a sense of his own worth, despite the world's attempts to deny it. He'd been born free, thanks to her purchase, and she wanted him to live like it mattered. She had hopes for his future, dreams of what he might become now that he wasn't property. In 1860, 5 years after purchasing her freedom, Elizabeth made a decision that would change everything. She moved to Washington, D.C. She was 42 years old, a free woman with extraordinary skills and a son she'd raised to be proud and strong. The move was strategic. Washington was the capital, full of wealthy women who needed dressmakers, full of opportunity for someone with her talents. It was also full of risk. She'd be leaving behind the client base she'd built in St. Louis, starting over in a new city where nobody knew her work. But Elizabeth had confidence in her abilities. She knew she could build a business anywhere. She arrived in Washington with her skills, her reputation, and her determination. She established herself as a dressmaker, renting space, advertising her services, taking on initial clients. The work was good. Her reputation spread quickly. Word of mouth brought her more clients. Within months, she was building a successful business in the capital. Then came March 4th, 1861, Abraham Lincoln's Inauguration Day. The nation was fracturing. Southern states were seceding. War was coming. The city was tense, uncertain, divided. And Elizabeth Keckley was about to meet the woman who'd change her life. The meeting happened the day after the inauguration. Mary Todd Lincoln was overwhelmed, distressed about preparing for an upcoming White House event. She needed help, needed it immediately, and someone recommended Elizabeth. When Elizabeth arrived for the interview, she found the First Lady upset and anxious. Mary Lincoln had a reputation for being difficult, demanding, temperamental. She'd already gone through several dressmakers who couldn't satisfy her or couldn't handle her moods. This was Elizabeth's moment. She could have been intimidated by the setting, by the power, by the enormous gap between where she'd started and where she now stood. Instead, she was calm, capable, professional. She assessed what Mary Lincoln needed and assured her she could deliver. She spoke with confidence, but not arrogance, with respect, but not servility. She presented herself as an equal professional, someone who could solve the First Lady's problems. Mary Todd Lincoln hired her on the spot, not just as a dressmaker, but as her personal modiste and personal dresser. This meant intimate access. This meant trust. This meant Elizabeth would be in the First Lady's private chambers, helping her dress, listening to her worries, becoming part of her daily life. From enslaved woman to First Lady's confidant in 6 years. Think about that trajectory. Think about what that required. The work was demanding. Mary Lincoln was particular about her appearance, anxious about public perception, desperate to be seen as elegant and appropriate. She was criticized constantly in the press for her spending, her Southern background, her personality. Every dress she wore was scrutinized, every public appearance analyzed. Elizabeth had to create garments that would withstand that scrutiny, that would make Mary look presidential, that would silence at least some of the criticism. Elizabeth created elaborate gowns for state dinners, receptions, balls. She worked with the finest fabrics, the most expensive materials. She'd measure and cut and sew, creating garments that fit Mary's body perfectly, that flattered her figure, that made her feel confident. The work required not just technical skill, but psychological insight. Elizabeth had to understand Mary's insecurities, anticipate her needs, provide reassurance along with clothing. The relationship between Elizabeth and Mary Lincoln grew beyond professional. They became friends, real friends, despite the enormous differences in their backgrounds. Mary Lincoln was the daughter of a slaveholding family from Kentucky. Elizabeth had been enslaved. Yet they found connection, found understanding, found genuine affection for each other. Elizabeth saw Mary's vulnerabilities, her insecurities, her struggles with public criticism and political pressure. Mary saw Elizabeth's dignity, her intelligence, her strength. They'd talk while Elizabeth worked. Mary would confide her worries about the war, about her husband's stress, about her sons, about the constant attacks in the press. Elizabeth would listen, offer perspective, provide comfort. She became one of the few people Mary trusted completely. In the White House, surrounded by political intrigue and social judgment, Mary found in Elizabeth someone who saw her as a person, not just a role. Elizabeth also witnessed history from an extraordinary vantage point. She was in the White House during the Civil War, seeing the toll it took on the Lincoln family, watching the president age under the weight of the conflict. She saw the private moments, the family dinners, the interactions between Abraham and Mary, the relationship between the parents and their sons. She was privy to conversations about the war's progress, about political decisions, about the human cost of the conflict. Then came August 10th, 1861, just months after Elizabeth began working at the White House. Her son George was killed at the Battle of Wilson's Creek in Missouri. He'd enlisted in the Union Army, passing as white because black men couldn't serve yet. He'd taken the name George Kirtland when he enlisted, using the surname of the man who'd raped his mother. The irony was bitter. He'd hidden his identity as a formerly enslaved person, hidden his mother's sacrifice to free him, hidden everything about who he really was so he could fight for the Union. He fought for the freedom his mother had purchased for him, fought for a country that still didn't fully recognize his humanity, and he died in one of the war's early battles. He was 22 years old. He was buried in a mass grave, later reinterred as unknown in Springfield National Cemetery. Elizabeth couldn't even properly claim his body, couldn't establish his identity, couldn't give him the burial he deserved. The son she'd worked 3 years to free, the son she'd raised with such hope and pride, was gone. The grief was crushing. Elizabeth had sacrificed everything to free her son, had worked for years to give him a future. And now he was gone. The future she'd imagined for him, all the dreams she'd held, all the reasons she'd endured so much, they died with him. But Elizabeth didn't collapse. She couldn't afford to. She had work to do, responsibilities to fulfill, a position to maintain. She grieved privately, carried the loss inside her, kept functioning because that's what she'd always done. Her grief, though, positioned her uniquely when tragedy struck the Lincoln family. In February 1862, Willie Lincoln, the Lincolns' 11-year-old son, died of typhoid fever in the White House. Mary Lincoln was devastated, nearly destroyed by the loss. She couldn't function, couldn't stop crying, couldn't accept that her son was gone, and Elizabeth, who'd lost her own son just 6 months earlier, became a source of strength and comfort. She understood that specific grief, that particular agony of losing a child. She could sit with Mary in her sorrow in a way few others could. Their friendship deepened through shared loss, through the bond of mothers who'd buried their sons. But Elizabeth wasn't just supporting the First Lady. In April 1862, the District of Columbia emancipated all enslaved persons within its borders. Suddenly, hundreds of newly freed people were arriving in Washington with nowhere to go, no resources, no support system. They were called contraband, a term that reduced human beings to property status even in freedom. They'd escaped from slavery or been freed by Union forces, and they were flooding into the capital with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Elizabeth saw the need and acted. She founded the Contraband Relief Association in August 1862. She organized it, led it, raised funds for it. The association provided food, shelter, clothing, and emotional support to recently freed slaves. It extended services to sick and wounded soldiers too. Elizabeth was running a humanitarian organization while maintaining her dressmaking business and serving as the First Lady's confidant. Think about that workload. Think about that commitment. She recruited other free black women to help. She solicited donations from wealthy white patrons. She organized fundraising events. She personally distributed supplies, visited the contraband camps, assessed needs, coordinated responses. The work was exhausting and heartbreaking. These were people who'd escaped with nothing, who'd risked everything for freedom, who needed immediate help to survive. Elizabeth saw herself in them, remembered what it was like to have nothing, understood their vulnerability. The association provided practical assistance, food for people who were starving, clothing for people who had only rags, shelter for people sleeping outside, medical care for people who were sick, but it also provided dignity and hope. Elizabeth made sure the people they helped were treated with respect, were seen as human beings with value, were given not just charity but genuine care. She raised significant funds for the organization. She leveraged her connections to wealthy white women, including Mary Lincoln, to solicit donations. She organized events where prominent people would contribute. She kept meticulous records of donations and expenditures, making sure every dollar was used effectively. The association became one of the most important relief organizations in wartime Washington, helping hundreds of people survive and transition to freedom. This is what mastery looks like, not just achieving success for yourself, but using that success to lift others. Elizabeth had every reason to focus solely on her own security, her own business, her own advancement. Instead, she founded an organization that served the most vulnerable people in the city. She led it personally, stayed closely involved, made sure it fulfilled its mission. She'd transformed from someone who needed help to someone who provided it. The war years continued. Elizabeth kept sewing, kept supporting Mary Lincoln, kept running the Relief Association. She was living a life she'd built entirely herself. She'd gone from supporting 17 Garland family members as an enslaved woman to supporting hundreds of freed people as a free entrepreneur. She'd gone from being beaten and raped to being trusted by the most powerful woman in America. She'd purchased her freedom and her sons, established a successful business, gained access to the highest levels of society, and founded an organization that made real difference in people's lives. She witnessed the end of the war from inside the White House. She saw the relief when Richmond fell, the joy when Lee surrendered, the hope that maybe the country could heal. She saw Abraham Lincoln in those final days, exhausted but hopeful, talking about reconstruction and reconciliation. She was there in the White House on April 14, 1865, when the Lincolns left for Ford's Theater. She didn't know it would be the last time she'd see the president alive. When Lincoln was assassinated, Elizabeth was there for Mary in her grief. She helped dress Mary in mourning clothes, sat with her through the funeral preparations, provided whatever comfort she could. Mary's grief was overwhelming, compounded by guilt and shock and the sudden loss of her position. Elizabeth stayed close, offering the same support Mary had received after Willie's death, the same understanding born of shared loss. After Lincoln's death, Mary Lincoln left Washington. Her relationship with Elizabeth continued through letters. They wrote to each other regularly, maintaining the friendship they'd built during those intense White House years. Elizabeth continued her dressmaking business in Washington, continued her work with the Relief Association, continued building her life as a free woman of accomplishment. But here's where the story takes its devastating turn. Here's where we see what happens when a woman who'd been forced into silence her entire life decides to speak. In 1868, 7 years after Lincoln's assassination, 3 years after the war ended, Elizabeth published a memoir. She called it Behind the Scenes, or 30 Years a Slave and 4 Years in the White House. She wrote it, she said, to defend herself and Mary Todd Lincoln. Mary had been criticized harshly in the press, attacked for her spending, her grief, her behavior. There'd been a scandal about her trying to sell her old dresses to raise money. The press had been vicious, portraying her as greedy and inappropriate. Elizabeth wanted to set the record straight, wanted to show the Mary Lincoln she knew, wanted to defend her friend. The book revealed insider details about the Lincoln family. It talked about private conversations, personal struggles, intimate moments. It described Mary's grief after Willie's death, her anxiety about money, her relationship with her husband. It included letters Mary had written to Elizabeth, personal correspondence that revealed Mary's private thoughts. Elizabeth wrote about her own experiences too, about her years in slavery, about purchasing her freedom, about building her business. She presented herself as a successful woman who'd overcome enormous obstacles, someone whose story deserved to be told. The book was honest, it was detailed, it was Elizabeth's truth about her time in the White House and her relationship with the Lincolns, and it destroyed everything. Mary Todd Lincoln considered the publication a gross betrayal. She felt Elizabeth had violated her privacy, had exploited their friendship, had sold their intimacy for profit. The letters Elizabeth had included were particularly painful. Mary had written them in confidence, trusting Elizabeth completely, never imagining they'd be published for the world to read. She felt exposed, humiliated, betrayed by the one person she'd trusted most during her worst years. Mary permanently severed all contact with Elizabeth. The woman who'd been her closest confidant during the worst years of her life, the woman who'd comforted her through Willie's death and Lincoln's assassination, the woman she'd trusted completely, was now dead to her. Mary never spoke to Elizabeth again. She refused to acknowledge her, refused to respond to letters, refused to accept any explanation or apology. The friendship was over, destroyed by what Mary saw as unforgivable betrayal. But it wasn't just Mary who turned against her. White society ostracized Elizabeth. They saw her as someone who'd overstepped, who'd forgotten her place, who'd dared to speak publicly about private matters. The fact that she'd been enslaved made it worse in their eyes. How dare someone who'd been property presume to write about the First Lady? How dare she claim friendship with Mary Lincoln as if they were equals? How dare she profit from intimate knowledge gained through service? Many denied her status as a successful person, tried to erase her achievements, tried to reduce her back to what she'd been. Newspapers that had previously praised her work now attacked her character. Former clients distanced themselves. The social access she'd built was withdrawn. She was reminded, brutally and publicly, that her rise had been conditional, that her acceptance had limits, that speaking her truth would cost her everything. Black elite society was conflicted too. Some supported her right to tell her story. They saw the memoir as an important document, a formerly enslaved woman claiming her narrative and her place in history. They admired her courage in speaking publicly about her experiences, but others felt she'd damaged the community's reputation by airing private details about powerful white people. They worried that her actions would reflect badly on all black people trying to advance in white society. They wished she'd stayed silent, maintained the discretion that had made her acceptable. Elizabeth's dressmaking business collapsed. She lost clients, lost income, lost the professional reputation she'd spent years building. Women who'd valued her work now refused to hire her. The intimate access that had been her greatest asset became her greatest liability. Nobody wanted a dressmaker who might write about them, who might reveal their private conversations, who might publish their letters. Trust was essential in her profession, and Elizabeth had been branded untrustworthy. The book she'd written to defend Mary Lincoln had cost her everything. It's been described by historians as perhaps one of the first examples of celebrity gossip publishing gone awry, but that framing misses something crucial. Elizabeth wasn't trying to create scandal. She was trying to tell her truth, to defend someone she cared about, to claim her own narrative after a lifetime of having it controlled by others. Think about what she was up against. She'd been enslaved for 37 years. 37 years of being told she had no right to speak, no right to her own story, no right to define her own experience. Then she'd spent years in the White House, privy to intimate details, trusted with secrets but still expected to remain silent. The unspoken rule was clear. She could be present, could be trusted, could even be befriended, but she couldn't speak about it. Her voice was acceptable only in private, only in service, only when it didn't challenge the narratives white people wanted to tell. When she finally spoke, when she finally claimed her story as her own, society punished her for it. The very people who'd benefited from her silence couldn't tolerate her voice. They wanted her labor, her skill, her discretion, but not her perspective. They wanted her to serve, but not to speak. They wanted her to be present in their lives, but absent from the historical record. The years after the memoir's publication were hard. Elizabeth kept working as a seamstress, but the clients were fewer, the income smaller, the social standing diminished. She'd gone from dressing the First Lady to struggling to maintain her business. She'd gone from being celebrated to being shunned. The Relief Association she'd founded continued its work, but her role in it diminished as her reputation suffered. She was still involved, still committed to helping freed people, but her leadership was questioned, her judgment doubted. She lived through these years with what sources consistently describe as dignity and self-reliance. She didn't publicly defend herself beyond the memoir itself. She didn't attack Mary Lincoln for cutting her off. She didn't try to win back the clients who'd abandoned her. She simply kept working, kept living, kept maintaining her independence, even as her circumstances declined. In 1892, when Elizabeth was 74 years old, she was offered a teaching position at Wilberforce University in Ohio. Wilberforce was the first black-owned and operated college in America, founded in 1856 by the African Methodist Episcopal Church. They wanted Elizabeth to head their Department of Sewing and Domestic Science Arts. Despite everything that had happened, despite the scandal and ostracism, Wilberforce recognized her skills and her achievements. They saw past the controversy to the woman who'd built a successful business, who'd served a First Lady, who'd helped hundreds of freed people. She accepted. She moved to Ohio to teach young students the skills that had bought her freedom, that had built her business, that had given her access to power. She taught them how to sew, how to construct garments, how to work with different fabrics. But she also taught them about professionalism, about discretion, about building a reputation, about navigating white society while maintaining dignity. She passed on not just technical skills, but survival strategies. She led a quiet life at Wilberforce, earning modest income, staying professionally active into her 70s. The students respected her, valued her knowledge, appreciated her patience. She was known as a demanding but fair teacher, someone who expected excellence but supported students in achieving it. She found purpose in teaching, in passing on what she knew, in preparing the next generation. But illness eventually forced her to retire. She suffered a stroke that ended her teaching career. Her body, which had endured so much over so many years, finally gave out. She couldn't sew anymore, couldn't stand for long periods, couldn't maintain the physical demands of teaching. She returned to Washington, the city where she'd achieved her greatest success and experienced her worst betrayal. She had nowhere else to go. The woman who'd once dressed the First Lady, who'd founded a relief organization, who'd purchased her own freedom and built a business from nothing, returned to Washington with nothing. She became a resident at the National Home for Destitute Colored Women and Children, the institution she'd helped found and establish. The organization she'd worked to create for others now housed her. Think about that circle. Think about that irony. The humanitarian who'd served the most vulnerable ended her life needing the charity she'd organized. The National Home provided basic shelter, food, and care. It wasn't luxurious, but it was dignified. Elizabeth lived there with other elderly black women who had nowhere else to go, who'd outlived their resources, who needed help in their final years. She was one of many, no longer special, no longer distinguished by her achievements, just another old woman who'd worked hard all her life and ended up with nothing. Elizabeth Keckley died on May 26, 1907. She was 89 years old. She died at the National Home, surrounded by other destitute women, forgotten by the society she'd once moved through with such grace and skill. There were no notable obituaries. No public recognition of her passing, no acknowledgement of her extraordinary life. The newspapers that had once written about her work for the First Lady, that had later attacked her for the memoir, now ignored her death completely. She was interred at Columbian Harmony Cemetery, and the world moved on as if she'd never transformed it. She'd lived 52 years as a free woman. 52 years of self-reliance, of determination, of refusing to be defined by what had been done to her. She'd purchased her freedom, built a business, served a First Lady, founded a relief organization, published a memoir, taught at a university. She'd done everything right. She'd worked harder than anyone should have to work. She'd risen higher than anyone thought possible, and she died impoverished and forgotten. So let's come back to that question. What does it mean to achieve everything you fought for, to rise higher than anyone thought possible, only to watch it all crumble because you dared to tell the truth? Here's the answer, and it's not the one we want to hear. It means that some systems are designed to punish truth-telling. It means that breaking silence threatens power. It means that a woman who'd been enslaved, who'd been raped, who'd been beaten, who'd purchased her own freedom and risen to extraordinary heights, still wasn't allowed to own her own story. The same society that had claimed ownership of her body for 37 years claimed ownership of her narrative for the rest of her life. When she tried to take it back, when she tried to speak her truth, she lost everything. But here's what they couldn't take from her. They couldn't take the fact that she did it. She purchased her freedom. She built a business. She dressed a First Lady. She founded an organization that helped hundreds of people. She taught students who carried her skills forward. She wrote a book that still exists, that historians still read, that tells us things about the Lincoln White House we wouldn't know otherwise. They ostracized her, they impoverished her, they forgot her, but they couldn't erase what she'd accomplished. Elizabeth's story reveals something profound about transformation that we need to understand. Transformation isn't just about rising, it's about what you do with the position you reach and what you're willing to risk to claim your own voice. She didn't just escape slavery and build a comfortable life. She used her freedom to help others gain theirs, used her access to power to advocate for the powerless, and used her final years to teach the next generation. But she also used her voice to tell her truth, knowing it would cost her everything. That's not just success, that's courage. The cost of speaking truth is often everything. Elizabeth's memoir destroyed her life, but it also preserved her story. Without that book, we'd know far less about her. We'd have fewer details about her relationship with Mary Lincoln, about life in the White House, about her own experiences of slavery and freedom. She paid an enormous price to claim her narrative, but she claimed it. That matters. She refused to let others tell her story for her, refused to stay silent just to maintain her position, refused to accept that her voice didn't matter. Being forgotten doesn't mean you failed. Elizabeth died in obscurity, but her impact didn't die with her. The students she taught carried forward her skills. The people her relief organization helped survived because of her work. The historical record she left gives us insight into a crucial period of American history. She transformed not just her own life, but the lives of countless others. That transformation doesn't disappear just because society chose not to honor it. Think about the scope of what she overcame. She was born into slavery, the daughter of rape. She was beaten as a teenager. She was raped for 4 years. She gave birth to a son conceived in violence. She was separated from her father figure. She labored for 37 years in bondage. Then she purchased her freedom, built a business, became the First Lady's confidant, founded a humanitarian organization, lost her son in war, published a memoir, was betrayed and ostracized, taught at a university, and died in a charity home. That's not one transformation. That's a lifetime of transformations, each one requiring everything she had. And here's what makes her story so powerful and so painful. She did everything we tell people to do. Work hard, develop skills, save money, build a business, help others, speak your truth. She did all of it, and the system still crushed her in the end. But the system didn't win. Because we're talking about her right now, because her story survived, because the transformation she achieved, the lives she touched, the narrative she claimed, they're still here. Elizabeth Keckley's life asks us to reconsider what we mean by success. If success is dying wealthy and celebrated, she failed. But if success is transforming yourself against impossible odds, using your freedom to help others find theirs, refusing to let violence and oppression define you, speaking truth even when it costs everything, then she succeeded beyond measure. She lived with what sources consistently describe as self-reliance from slavery through death. She stepped out of bondage into a future she could begin to control, and she never stopped controlling it, even when control meant losing everything. Her story is heartbreaking because it shows us that individual transformation, no matter how extraordinary, can't fully overcome systemic oppression. She rose as high as any formerly enslaved woman could rise in her era, and it still wasn't enough to protect her when she claimed her voice. But her story is also triumphant because she rose anyway, she transformed anyway, she spoke anyway, she refused to accept that her story belonged to anyone but herself. The woman who purchased her freedom for $1,200, who dressed a first lady, who founded a relief organization, who taught at a university, died in a home for destitute women. That's the tragedy. But the woman who was born into slavery, who survived rape and beatings, who raised a son alone, who built a business from nothing, who befriended the most powerful woman in America, who helped hundreds of freed slaves, who wrote a memoir that still teaches us today, she died free. She died having lived 52 years as a free woman who determined her own path. That's the triumph. So what do we do with Elizabeth's story? We remember it, we tell it, we refuse to let her be forgotten again. We recognize that transformation isn't always rewarded, that speaking truth often costs everything, that rising from oppression doesn't guarantee a happy ending. But we also recognize that the rising matters anyway, the transformation matters anyway, the truth matters anyway. Elizabeth Keckley transformed herself from property to entrepreneur, from victim to humanitarian, from silenced to speaker. The world punished her for it, but it couldn't undo it. Her transformation was real, her impact was real, her courage was real. And her story, the story she fought so hard to tell, the story that cost her everything, it's still here. We're still listening. That's not failure, that's immortality. What limitations in your own life might actually be fuel for your greatest transformation? What truth are you not speaking because you're afraid of the cost? What story are you letting others tell about you instead of claiming it yourself? Elizabeth Keckley shows us that transformation is possible even from the worst circumstances imaginable, but she also shows us that transformation doesn't guarantee comfort or recognition or reward. Sometimes transformation just means you lived free, you spoke your truth, and you refused to let anyone else define you. Sometimes that has to be enough. Share your thoughts below about what Elizabeth's story means to you. What part of her journey resonates most? What questions does her life raise about transformation, about truth-telling, about the price of freedom? Let's keep her story alive. Let's make sure she's not forgotten again. Because a woman who transformed herself from enslaved to free, from silenced to speaker, from forgotten to remembered, she deserves to be known. Her story deserves to be told. And maybe, just maybe, her courage to speak despite the cost will inspire someone else to claim their own narrative, to pursue their own transformation, to refuse to let anyone else define who they are or what they're worth.